The encounter on Elm Street. It was a hot summer afternoon, and the streets of Elmwood buzzed with life. Cars idled in gridlock, their drivers impatiently honking, while pedestrians bustled along the sidewalks. The city had its own rhythm, a chaotic symphony of voices, wheels, and urban life. On the corner of Elm Street, a boy named Malik sat quietly in his wheelchair, fiddling with a small basketball in his hands. He was 10 years old, with large, expressive eyes and a shy smile that made him appear younger than his years. Malik was waiting for his father, David, who had gone into the nearby store to pick up some supplies. Despite his physical challenges, Malik rarely complained. His father had always taught him resilience. The boy's wheelchair was custom-built, a gift from a local charity. It was sleek and efficient, but more importantly, it gave Malik independence. He cherished it like a lifeline. As the sun bore down relentlessly, Malik shaded his eyes and looked toward the store, hoping his father would return soon. Just then, a shadow loomed over him. He looked up to see a man in a police uniform standing tall and imposing, his expression unreadable at first. "Hey, kid," the officer barked, his voice gruff. "What are you doing here?" Malik blinked, startled by the sudden attention. "I'm waiting for my dad," he replied softly. The officer's expression hardened. "Waiting? For what? You think this is some kind of hangout spot?" Malik frowned, unsure of what he had done wrong. "I'm just sitting here. My dad will be right back." "Got any ID?" the officer demanded, his hand resting on his belt as if Malik posed a threat. The boy hesitated, confused. "ID? I'm only 10. I don't have any." The officer's gaze shifted to Malik's wheelchair. "What about that chair? You sure it's yours?" Malik's heart sank. "Yes, sir. It's mine." The man took a step closer, his towering presence suffocating. "You sure about that? I've seen a lot of stolen equipment end up on these streets." Malik's small hands gripped the armrests tightly. "I didn't steal it. My dad, he'll tell you." "Your dad?" the officer sneered. "Is that the story you were sticking with? Look, kid, I don't have all day for fairy tales." Malik's lips quivered, but he held back his tears. "Please, sir, I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer's face twisted with irritation. "You think you're special, sitting there in your fancy chair. You don't get to act like you're above the rules." Without warning, the officer grabbed the handles of Malik's wheelchair. "Let's see how you manage without this." "Wait, please don't," Malik cried out, his voice cracking with fear. He clung to the chair, but his frail arms were no match for the officer's strength. The commotion drew the attention of nearby pedestrians. Some paused, their curiosity piqued, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. A few murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped forward. With a rough yank, the officer pulled the wheelchair away, leaving Malik to tumble onto the pavement. The boy winced as his elbows scraped the concrete, small streaks of blood marking where he landed. His basketball rolled away, stopping near a woman's feet. "Serves you right," the officer said, tossing the wheelchair aside as if it were trash. "Next time, maybe you'll learn some respect." A murmur of shock spread through the crowd. A young woman with a toddler clutched her child closer. An elderly man shook his head in disbelief. A teenager began filming on their phone, their hands trembling. Malik lay on the ground, his body shaking with humiliation and pain. He looked around desperately, hoping someone would help him, but the crowd remained frozen, bound by their own fear and helplessness. And then, through the gathering tension, a voice rang out, steady, deep, and commanding. "Take your hands off my son." The crowd parted as David, Malik's father, stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence radiating quiet authority. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity that silenced even the boldest whispers. The officer turned to face him, his sneer returning. "Oh, this your kid? Figures. David's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "You have no right to touch him, much less take his wheelchair." He was loitering, the officer said defensively, though his tone wavered. "Looked suspicious." David's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Suspicious? He's a child waiting for his father." "Doesn't matter," the officer snapped. "He didn't have ID. And that chair, how do I know it's not stolen?" David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Because I paid for it. And you had no reason to lay a hand on him." The officer scoffed, but his bravado was fading under the weight of the crowd's silent judgment. "Look, I'm just doing my job." "Your job," David said, his voice cold and cutting, "is to protect and serve, not to harass and humiliate." By now, more people were filming. A few voices rose in support of David. "He's right," someone shouted. "This is wrong." The officer glanced nervously at the growing crowd. "You all need to step back," he barked, but the words lacked conviction. David crouched down, gently lifting Malik into his arms. The boy clung to his father, his small body trembling. "It's okay, Malik," David murmured. "I'm here now." He stood, his son cradled against his chest, and looked the officer in the eye. "You made a mistake today, one you won't forget." The officer bristled, his hand inching toward his baton. But before he could act, David spoke again, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Your badge doesn't make you invincible. It makes you accountable. And trust me, you will be held accountable." The crowd erupted into applause and shouts of agreement. The officer, now visibly flustered, stepped back, his bravado crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. As David turned to carry Malik away, the crowd parted to let them through, their murmurs of support following father and son. But David knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was just starting, and he was prepared to see it through. The echoes of injustice. The scene on Elm Street quickly dissolved into a whirlwind of emotion, a chaotic blend of indignation, disbelief, and determination. By the time David and Malik made it back to their car, the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily on both of them. Malik sat quietly in the passenger seat, his face pale and tear-streaked. His father adjusted the wheelchair in the trunk, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck pulsed visibly. "Dad!" Malik's small voice broke the silence as David climbed into the driver's seat. David turned to him, his expression softening. "Yes, son." "Did I do something wrong?" The question was like a dagger to David's heart. He reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "No, Malik. You didn't do anything wrong. What happened wasn't your fault. Do you understand me?" Malik nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. David's gaze hardened as he started the engine. He couldn't let his son believe, even for a second, that he had been at fault for another person's ignorance and cruelty. As they drove home, David's mind raced. He replayed the encounter, each word and action seared into his memory. He could still see the officer's smug face, hear the jeering tone, and feel the helpless rage that had consumed him when Malik was humiliated before the world. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about a system that allowed such behavior to flourish, unchecked and unchallenged. David had seen it before, stories on the news, shared posts on social media. But now it was personal, and he would not let it go. Back at their small apartment, David carried Malik inside and set him on the couch. Malik's favorite cartoon was playing on the TV, but the boy didn't seem interested. He stared at the floor, his hands fidgeting nervously. David knelt in front of him. "Listen to me, son. That man, what he did to you, was wrong. But we're going to make it right." "How?" Malik whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He's a cop." David smiled gently. "He's just a man wearing a badge. And no one is above the truth." After making sure Malik was comfortable, David retreated to his bedroom and powered up his laptop. He logged into his social media accounts, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he typed a detailed account of the incident. He included photos of Malik's scraped elbows and hands, a brief video someone from the crowd had sent him, and his own searing commentary on what had happened. Post: This afternoon, my 10-year-old son Malik, who uses a wheelchair, was harassed and humiliated by a police officer on Elm Street. Without any provocation or justification, the officer accused him of loitering and stealing his wheelchair. He then forcibly removed my son from his wheelchair, leaving him on the ground, injured and terrified. This is not just an act of individual cruelty, it's a reflection of systemic injustice that too many families face daily. But I will not stay silent. I will hold this officer accountable, and I am calling on my community to stand with us. Share this post. Let's make sure this cannot be ignored. #JusticeOrMalik. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Likes and comments poured in, some expressing outrage, others sharing similar experiences. I can't believe this happened. Stay strong, David. This is disgusting. How can anyone treat a child like this? Sending love and support to you and Malik. Let us know how we can help. By the next morning, the post had gone viral, shared thousands of times across various platforms. David's inbox was flooded with messages from journalists, activists, and strangers offering their support. Later that day, David received a call from a local reporter. "Mr. Carter, this is Monica Reed from Channel 7 News. We've seen your post, and we'd like to interview you and your son. Can you meet us at the scene of the incident?" David hesitated. He wanted to protect Malik, who was still shaken, but he knew the importance of amplifying their story. "I'll be there," he said. That afternoon, David stood at the corner of Elm Street, holding Malik's hand as cameras clicked and reporters jotted notes. Monica Reed held a microphone, her expression a mix of professionalism and sympathy. "Mr. Carter, can you tell us what happened yesterday?" David recounted the events with precision, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "This isn't just about my son. This is about accountability. It's about making sure no other child has to go through what Malik experienced." The camera panned to Malik, who sat in his wheelchair, clutching his basketball. Despite his father's encouragement, Malik spoke only a few words, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want people to be nice and not hurt me." As the interview aired that evening, the response was overwhelming. Calls for action echoed across social media, and rallies were planned to protest the officer's behavior. The hashtags #JusticeForMalik and #HoldHimAccountable trended nationwide. By the end of the week, the police department was forced to issue a statement. The officer, identified as Sergeant Eric Hayes, was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. But for David, this was not enough. Determined to see real change, David contacted a civil rights attorney and began organizing a community forum. He also connected with local activists, forming a coalition to push for greater accountability in law enforcement. One evening, as Malik sat at the kitchen table drawing, he looked up at his father. "Are we winning, Dad?" David knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're not done yet, but we're fighting. And as long as we fight, we're winning." Malik smiled, his eyes shining with hope. For the first time since the incident, he felt a flicker of pride, not just in his father, but in himself. The ripple effect. The story of Malik's ordeal had become more than a single incident. It was a catalyst for a movement. Across the city and beyond, people rallied around the injustice faced by the boy in the wheelchair. What started as a father's outrage had ignited a wave of unity and determination. David Carter, once a quiet man who lived for his son, now found himself at the center of a burgeoning fight for justice. His story had drawn attention not just locally but nationally, sparking discussions about abuse of power, systemic inequality, and the protection of vulnerable communities. The first rally. The first rally took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in the park just a few blocks from Elm Street. David stood at the edge of the stage, holding Malik's hand as he surveyed the crowd. Hundreds of people had gathered, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. Many carried signs with messages like "Justice for Malik," "Accountability for all," and "End abuse of power." Malik, still shy and reserved, clutched his basketball tightly. He glanced nervously at the crowd, and then up at his father. "Are you sure I have to go up there?" he asked quietly. David knelt down so they were at eye level. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, son. Just being here is enough. This is about you. About us." Malik nodded, his small fingers tightening around David's hand. Together, they stepped onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers as David approached the microphone. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but impassioned. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every child, every person who has ever been made to feel less than human because someone thought their badge, their position, or their power made them untouchable." The audience roared in agreement. David continued, his voice rising with conviction. "Malik didn't deserve what happened to him. No child does. And we won't stop until there is accountability, not just for Sergeant Hayes, but for every officer, every system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." He looked down at Malik, who was watching him with wide eyes. "This is my son," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "He's stronger than most adults I know. And he deserves to grow up in a world where justice isn't just a word, but a reality." The crowd erupted once more, chanting Malik's name. Malik's face lit up with a shy smile, and for the first time, he waved timidly at the audience. The movement grows. In the weeks that followed, the rally proved to be just the beginning. Social media became a battlefield for change, with hashtags like #JusticeForMalik and #EndPolicAbuse dominating timelines. Stories poured in from others who had faced similar treatment, their voices amplifying the movement's momentum. David worked tirelessly, balancing his job, caring for Malik, and dedicating countless hours to the cause. He partnered with local civil rights organizations, met with lawyers, and coordinated with activists to ensure the movement didn't lose steam. One evening, while David was drafting a speech, Malik wandered into the room. "Dad?" he said softly. David looked up, smiling. "What is it, buddy?" Malik hesitated before climbing onto the chair beside him. "Why are so many people helping us? They don't even know me." David reached out, pulling Malik into a hug. "Because, son, they see you. They see your strength, your courage. And they know what happened to you was wrong. They want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Malik nodded thoughtfully. "Does that mean I'm helping them too?" David's smile widened. "Yes, Malik. You're helping them just by being you." The backlash. With the movement's growing success came resistance. Online trolls flooded social media with hateful comments, accusing David of exploiting his son for attention. Some even defended Sergeant Hayes, claiming he was just doing his job. The negativity was a stark reminder of the deep divides in society. David ignored most of the noise, focusing on the positive. But one night, as he scrolled through his messages, he came across a particularly venomous comment. Maybe the kid deserved it. Probably just another welfare scammer looking for a payday. The words stung, but David refused to let them deter him. He closed his laptop and walked into Malik's room, where his son was fast asleep, clutching his basketball. Watching him, David's resolve only grew stronger. Malik's innocence and resilience were worth every fight, every sleepless night. Sergeant Hayes under fire. As pressure mounted, the police department's investigation into Sergeant Hayes began to unravel troubling details. Past complaints of misconduct surfaced, painting a picture of an officer who had long abused his power. Allegations ranged from verbal harassment to unnecessary use of force, most of which had been swept under the rug. David's legal team, bolstered by community support, pushed for transparency. They demanded access to Hayes's disciplinary records and called for an independent review of the department's handling of misconduct cases. The department, desperate to salvage its reputation, held a press conference. The police chief, visibly strained, announced that Hayes had been suspended without pay and that a formal inquiry was underway. For David and his supporters, it was a step forward, but far from enough. Malik's voice. One evening, during a community meeting, Malik surprised everyone by asking to speak. David was hesitant at first, worried the experience might overwhelm him, but Malik insisted. Standing before the group, Malik's small voice filled the room. "I was scared that day," he began. "But my dad wasn't. He stood up for me when I couldn't. And now all of you are standing up too." The room fell silent, captivated by the boy's bravery. "I don't want anyone else to feel like I did," Malik continued, his voice gaining strength. "We all deserve to be treated like we matter, even if we're small or different." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. David hugged his son tightly, tears streaming down his face. Malik had found his voice, and it was powerful. The turning point. As the movement gained national attention, lawmakers and public officials began to take notice. Proposals for police reform bills were introduced, focusing on accountability measures, mandatory de-escalation training, and protections for vulnerable populations. David was invited to speak at a congressional hearing on police misconduct. Nervous but resolute, he shared Malik's story and called for systemic change. "Laws mean nothing if they aren't enforced equally," David said. "And power means nothing if it's used to oppress instead of protect." The hearing marked a turning point. Malik's story had become a symbol, a reminder of the humanity often lost in the face of authority. The road ahead. While progress was being made, David knew the fight was far from over. The road to justice was long and fraught with challenges, but he was determined to see it through. For Malik, for their community, and for every person who had ever been made to feel powerless. As David tucked Malik into bed that night, his son looked up at him. "Dad, do you think people will remember us?" David smiled, brushing a hand over Malik's curls. "They'll remember you, son, because you're changing the world." Malik's eyes closed, his face peaceful, and as David watched him sleep, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about justice, it was about building a future where every child could feel safe, valued, and free. The legal battle. The Carter family's fight for justice had reached a pivotal moment. With Sergeant Eric Hayes under investigation and public pressure mounting, the legal battle against the officer and the system that enabled him began in earnest. David Carter, once a quiet man focused on raising his son, was now a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. But this part of the journey was not without its trials. The case is filed. David and his legal team, led by renowned civil rights attorney Maya Patel, filed a lawsuit against Sergeant Hayes and the city's police department. The lawsuit alleged misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic negligence in addressing complaints against officers like Hayes. "We're not just seeking justice for Malik," Maya explained at a press conference. "We're seeking accountability for a system that has failed to protect its citizens. This case is about more than one officer's actions. It's about the culture that allowed those actions to go unchecked." The press conference was packed with reporters, activists, and community members. David stood beside Maya, his expression resolute. Malik sat in his wheelchair, holding his basketball, his presence a poignant reminder of why they were there. "This is about my son," David said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "and every other child who deserves to grow up without fear of those sworn to protect them." The room erupted into applause, but David knew the real fight was just beginning. Discovery uncovers a pattern. As the legal process unfolded, Maya's team began digging into Hayes' record. What they found was damning. Over the course of his career, Hayes had been the subject of more than a dozen complaints, ranging from verbal harassment to excessive use of force. Yet most of these complaints had been dismissed or quietly settled, with little to no consequences for Hayes. One case involved a young black man who had been wrongfully arrested after questioning Hayes during a routine traffic stop. Another detailed an incident where Hayes had used unnecessary force against a woman protesting outside City Hall. Each story painted a picture of an officer who wielded his authority like a weapon. But it wasn't just Hayes. The investigation revealed systemic issues within the department, a culture of silence, where officers protected one another and complaints were routinely ignored or buried. This isn't just about one bad apple, Maya said during a televised interview. It's about an entire orchard that's been left to rot. Hayes fights back. Facing mounting evidence and public scrutiny, Hayes hired a high-profile attorney and launched a counter-narrative. His lawyer argued that Hayes had acted within the bounds of his authority and that the incident with Malik was being blown out of proportion by a media frenzy. At a press conference, Hayes made his first public appearance since the incident. His face was pale, and his voice wavered as he read from a prepared statement. "I have dedicated my career to serving and protecting this community. The allegations against me are not only false, but a direct attack on law enforcement everywhere." The statement did little to sway public opinion. Social media erupted with criticism, accusing Hayes of deflecting blame and refusing to take responsibility for his actions. "He's not the victim here," one user wrote. "Malik is." Despite the backlash, Hayes' legal team pushed forward, filing motions to dismiss the lawsuit and attempting to discredit David and Malik. They pointed to David's past activism, framing him as a troublemaker looking for attention. David refused to be intimidated. "This isn't about me," he said in an interview. "This is about justice for my son and every family that's been harmed by this system." The trial begins. Months later, the trial began in a packed courtroom. Journalists from across the country filled the gallery, eager to report on what had become a landmark case. The city was on edge, the trial representing not just the Carter's fight, but a broader struggle for justice and accountability. David and Malik arrived at the courthouse surrounded by supporters. Activists held signs that read "Justice for Malik" and "End Police Abuse." Malik, now more confident after months of support and encouragement, smiled shyly as people cheered for him. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution, led by Maya, presented a compelling case. Witnesses from the Elm Street incident testified about Hayes' behavior, describing how he had yanked Malik from his wheelchair and humiliated him in front of the crowd. "He treated that child like he wasn't even human," one witness said, their voice shaking with emotion. Maya also introduced video evidence, including the footage recorded by bystanders. The clips were played on a large screen, showing Hayes' actions in vivid detail. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the videos played, the images leaving no doubt about what had occurred. When it was David's turn to testify, he spoke with unwavering resolve. "That man didn't see my son as a child," he said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "He saw him as less than human. And that's not just a failure of one officer. That's a failure of the entire system." Malik's moment. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Malik took the stand. Despite his initial reluctance, Malik had decided he wanted to tell his story. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and sitting tall in his wheelchair, he looked directly at the judge as he spoke. "I was scared," Malik said, his voice trembling but strong. "I didn't know why he was yelling at me. I just wanted to wait for my dad. And when he took my wheelchair, I felt like I didn't matter." His words brought tears to many in the courtroom, including members of the jury. Even the judge seemed visibly moved. "Malik," Maya said gently, "what do you want to happen now?" Malik thought for a moment before answering. "I just want people like him to stop hurting kids like me. I want them to know it's wrong." The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 tense days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sergeant Eric Hayes, liable for misconduct and abuse of power," the foreperson announced. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, followed by applause. Hayes sat stone-faced, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. The court awarded damages to the Carters, but for David, it wasn't about the money. It was about the message that no one was above accountability. Outside the courthouse, David addressed the crowd. "This is a victory, not just for my son, but for every person who has ever felt powerless. This is proof that when we stand together, we can make a difference." Malik, sitting beside his father, held up a small sign someone had given him. It read, "We matter." The crowd erupted in applause, chanting Malik's name as David hugged his son tightly. A movement takes root. The trial's outcome sent ripples across the nation. Cities began reviewing their police oversight practices, and activists pushed for reforms to hold law enforcement accountable. Malik's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of community. For David and Malik, life slowly returned to normal. But they knew their fight had made a difference. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Malik looked up at his father. "Dad, are you proud of me?" David smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "More than you'll ever know, son. You're my hero." Malik grinned, his basketball resting on his lap. And as they sat together, watching the sunset, they knew their story had changed the world, one act of courage at a time. The aftermath of justice. The courtroom victory against Sergeant Eric Hayes marked a turning point in the Carter family's journey. However, David and Malik knew that their fight for justice was far from over. The trial had exposed systemic failures that extended well beyond a single officer, and the momentum they had built demanded action. While the legal battle had been taxing, the aftermath brought new challenges, both personal and societal, as the Carter family navigated the ripple effects of their landmark case. A new normal. In the days following the verdict, David and Malik tried to settle back into their routine, but life had changed. Malik returned to school, where he was greeted like a hero. Teachers and classmates approached him with words of encouragement, and his story became a source of inspiration for the other children. Malik, his teacher, Mrs. Thompson, said one afternoon, "You've taught all of us something important, that standing up for what's right can make a real difference." Malik beamed with pride, his confidence growing with each passing day. Yet he still struggled with the lingering trauma of that fateful encounter. Small things, like the sight of a police car or the sound of a loud voice, could bring back flashes of fear. David noticed and took steps to ensure his son felt safe. "Do you want to talk about it?" David asked one evening as they sat together on the couch. Malik shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Not yet, Dad. Maybe later." David nodded, respecting his son's pace. "Whenever you're ready, buddy, just know I'm here." Community and activism. As the dust settled, David found himself increasingly drawn into community activism. The case had turned him into a local figure, and people looked to him for leadership. David partnered with civil rights organizations and grassroots groups to push for systemic reforms within the police department. One evening, he attended a town hall meeting organized by the city council to address police misconduct. The room was packed with community members eager to share their stories and demand change. David stood at the podium, his voice steady and resolute. "My son's case was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a system that protects power at the expense of justice. We cannot let this moment pass without real, meaningful reform." The audience erupted into applause, and several council members nodded in agreement. Proposals for independent oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, and de-escalation training began to take shape. David worked tirelessly to ensure these proposals didn't languish in bureaucracy. The backlash. Not everyone was supportive of the changes David and his allies were fighting for. There was significant pushback from some members of law enforcement and their supporters. Online, hate groups targeted David and his family with vile messages and threats. "You think you're a hero, but you're just making it harder for good cops to do their jobs," one anonymous email read. David brushed off the threats, But when Malik overheard a conversation about them, he became visibly anxious. "Dad, are they going to come after us?" Malik asked one night, his voice trembling. David knelt down and looked his son in the eye. "No one is going to hurt us, Malik. I promise you that. We have so many people on our side. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who believe in what we're doing. We're not alone." Malik nodded, but David could see the worry lingering in his son's eyes. It was a reminder that the fight for justice came with personal costs, ones that weighed heavily on them both. Legislative victory. Months after the trial, the City Council passed a sweeping police reform bill. Among its provisions were the establishment of an independent oversight board, stricter accountability measures for officers, and mandatory sensitivity training to address bias. David and Malik were invited to the signing ceremony, where they stood alongside city officials and activists who had worked tirelessly to make the reforms a reality. As the mayor signed the bill into law, he turned to Malik with a smile. "Malik, this wouldn't have happened without you," he said. "You've inspired this entire city to be better." Malik blushed but managed a small smile. He looked up at his father, who gave him a reassuring nod. Healing and growth. As the movement continued to gain traction, the Carter family focused on healing. David encouraged Malik to express his feelings through art, and the boy began drawing and painting as a way to process his emotions. His work, often depicting scenes of hope and resilience, caught the attention of a local gallery, which offered to host an exhibition of his art. At the opening night of the exhibition, Malik stood beside his paintings, shyly accepting compliments from visitors. One piece, titled "The Light," depicted a small boy holding a lantern, surrounded by darkness. "It's about finding hope, even when everything feels scary," Malik explained to one admirer. "My dad helped me find it." David, standing nearby, felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized that despite the pain and challenges, Malik had found his own way to inspire others. National recognition. Malik's story continued to resonate far beyond their city. David was invited to speak at conferences and panels about police reform, while Malik's artwork was featured in a national campaign promoting equality and justice. One evening, they received an invitation to the White House, where they were honored for their contributions to social justice. Standing in the Grand Hall, surrounded by leaders and advocates, David felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in what they had accomplished, but in Malik's resilience. When the president handed Malik a medal for his courage, the boy's smile lit up the room. "You've shown us all what it means to be brave," the president said. Looking forward, as the years passed, the Carter family remained deeply involved in the fight for justice. Malik, now a teenager, became an advocate in his own right, speaking at schools and events about his experiences. One day, as they walked together in the park, Malik turned to his father. "Dad, do you think we made a difference?" David smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Look around, Malik. The changes we see, the people standing up for what's right. It all started with you." Malik nodded thoughtfully, his face filled with quiet determination. "Then let's keep going." David laughed. "Always, son." As they continued walking, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow. Their journey had been long and difficult, but it was far from over. Together, they would keep fighting, keep building, and keep inspiring others to stand up for justice. And in that moment, David realized that while their story had begun with pain, it had grown into something far greater, a legacy of hope, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of equality. A legacy of change. The years that followed the trial were transformative, not just for the Carter family, but for their city and beyond. Malik's story had sparked a movement that refused to lose momentum. What had begun as a father's fight for his son's dignity had grown into a larger collective effort to address systemic injustice. By the time Malik reached his teenage years, he was no longer just the boy in a wheelchair. He had become a symbol of resilience, an artist, an advocate, and a voice for those who often went unheard. But as the movement matured, so did the challenges and the opportunities. The foundation. Shortly after the city's police reform bill was enacted, David and Malik established the Malik Carter Foundation. Its mission was to support children with disabilities, advocate for systemic justice, and provide resources to families impacted by discrimination. At the foundation's grand opening, hundreds gathered to celebrate. The building was modest, but filled with hope. Walls were adorned with Malik's artwork, each piece telling a story of overcoming adversity. The centerpiece was his painting titled Hope Rising, which depicted a tree growing tall and strong, its roots breaking through concrete. David spoke to the crowd with pride. This foundation is not just about Malik's story. It's about ensuring that no child feels powerless, that no family feels alone in their fight for justice. Malik, now 14, stood beside him. Though he was still shy in front of large crowds, he mustered the courage to say a few words. "Thank you for believing in me," he said softly. "I hope this place can help others find their strength, like my dad helped me find mine." The audience erupted in applause, and Malik smiled, his confidence growing with every cheer. Challenges on the horizon. Running the foundation was not without its hurdles. While the public largely supported their mission, there were still pockets of resistance. Some accused the Carters of exploiting their story for personal gain, while others dismissed their efforts as performative activism. David took these criticisms in stride, focusing on the positive impact they were making. The foundation provided scholarships for children with disabilities, hosted workshops on racial equity, and partnered with local law enforcement to develop training programs on community engagement. One day, during a workshop, a young boy named Jamal approached Malik. Jamal, also in a wheelchair, had been bullied at school and struggled with self-esteem. "Malik," he said hesitantly, "how did you get so brave?" Malik thought for a moment before replying. "I wasn't always brave, but my dad taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do what's right anyway." Jamal's eyes lit up. "I want to be brave like you." "You already are," Malik said with a grin. Moments like these reminded the Carters why their work was so important. National spotlight. As the foundation's reach grew, so did its visibility. Malik was invited to speak at national conferences, sharing his story with audiences that included activists, educators, and policymakers. Though public speaking was daunting at first, Malik embraced the opportunity to inspire others. At one event, Malik stood before a crowd of thousands. His voice, once timid, was now clear and steady. "What happened to me wasn't fair," he said, "but it taught me something important. We're all stronger when we stand together. And we have the power to make the world better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." His words earned a standing ovation, and Malik's story was later featured in a documentary about youth activism. The film, titled Rising Voices, chronicled Malik's journey and the broader fight for justice. It garnered critical acclaim and brought even more attention to the foundation's work. Personal growth. While Malik thrived in his role as an advocate, he also faced the typical challenges of adolescence. He struggled with self-doubt, particularly when critics resurfaced online to question his achievements. "Dad," he said one evening, "what if they're right? What if I'm not really making a difference?" David put down the book he was reading and looked at his son. "Malik, do you remember Jamal? Or the kid who wrote letters saying how much your story inspired them? That's your difference. It's not about what critics say. It's about the lives you've touched." Malik nodded, his father's words sinking in. "I just don't want to let anyone down." David smiled, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "You won't, because you're doing this from the heart." With renewed determination, Malik continued to grow, not just as an advocate, but as a young man finding his place in the world. A system transformed. The reforms sparked by Malik's case began to take root. The police department, once resistant to change, now had an independent oversight board that investigated misconduct and held officers accountable. Community engagement programs flourished, fostering trust between law enforcement and residents. One of the most significant changes was the creation of the Malik Carter Fellowship Program, which trained officers in de-escalation techniques and cultural competency. The program's success led to its adoption in cities across the country. Malik and David were often invited to speak at training sessions, sharing their story as a reminder of the human impact of systemic failures. Remember, David told a group of officers during one session, "Every interaction you have is an opportunity to build trust, or to break it. Choose to build." The officers listened intently, many leaving the session with a new perspective. A moment of reflection. Years later, on the anniversary of the Elm Street incident, David and Malik returned to the spot where it all began. The street had changed. There was now a mural painted on the side of a building, depicting Malik holding his basketball with the words, "Strength and Justice," written above. Malik, now 18, ran his fingers over the edge of his wheelchair. "It feels so different now," he said quietly. David nodded. "That's because you've changed it, Malik. You turned something terrible into something powerful." Malik looked at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it together, Dad." As they stood there, a small crowd began to gather. Strangers approached, thanking Malik for his courage and sharing how his story had impacted their lives. One woman, holding her young son's hand, said, "Because of you, my child knows he has a voice. Thank you." Malik smiled, his heart full. He realized that his journey wasn't just about the past, it was about the future he was helping to build. The future ahead. As the sun set over Elm Street, David and Malik walked toward their car, their bond stronger than ever. Malik's story had become a legacy, one that would inspire generations to come. But for David, the greatest victory wasn't the systemic changes or the national recognition. It was watching his son grow into a man who believed in himself and the power of justice. "Dad," Malik said as they drove away, "do you think we'll ever stop fighting?" David glanced at his son, a proud smile on his face. "The fight for justice never really ends, Malik. But we've shown the world that one voice, your voice, can make all the difference." Malik leaned back, gazing out the window as the city lights blurred into a golden haze. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep fighting. For himself, for others, for a world where every child could dream without fear. And in that moment, Malik felt the weight of his journey, not as a burden, but as a gift. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of hope could shine through. Together, he and his father had proven that justice wasn't just a dream. It was a promise they would continue to keep. A legacy fulfilled. A global movement. The impact of Malik's story extended beyond the city and even the nation. As his foundation gained traction, its programs were replicated in other countries. Advocacy groups from around the world reached out, eager to learn from the Carter's experience and implement similar reforms in their own communities. Malik, now a young adult, traveled internationally, speaking at conferences and meeting with leaders who sought his advice. His once shy demeanor had blossomed into quiet confidence. He used his platform to emphasize the importance of empathy and justice, often reminding audiences, "We're stronger when we stand together." During one of his trips to a developing country, Malik visited a school for children with disabilities. The students greeted him with wide smiles, their faces lighting up when he spoke to them. One boy, using a rudimentary wheelchair, approached Malik and asked through an interpreter, "How did you keep going when it was hard?" Malik knelt to meet the boy at eye level, a warm smile on his face. "Because I knew I wasn't alone. My dad, my community, they believed in me. And I believed in myself. And guess what? You have that same strength inside you." The boy's eyes sparkled, and Malik felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like this reminded him why the fight was worth it. Personal milestones. Despite his public success, Malik valued his personal life and cherished his relationship with his father. David, now graying at the temples, remained his unwavering supporter and confidant. The two spent time together hiking accessible trails, watching documentaries, and discussing the future. One evening, as they sat on their porch overlooking the city, Malik turned to his father. "You know, Dad, everything we've done, it's because of you." David chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Malik, it's because of us. You gave me the strength to fight. Watching you overcome everything life threw at you, it made me believe we could change the world." Malik smiled. "We did, didn't we?" David nodded. "We sure did, son." The new generation. As Malik continued his work, the next generation of advocates began to emerge. Many credited Malik's story as their inspiration. Among them was Jamal, the young boy Malik had once encouraged at the foundation. Now a teenager, Jamal spoke at events and even started his own initiative to provide adaptive sports equipment for children with disabilities. At one of Jamal's events, Malik sat in the audience, watching with pride as the young advocate addressed the crowd. "Malik Carter taught me that being brave isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." After the event, Malik approached Jamal, his heart swelling with pride. "You're doing incredible work," he said. Jamal grinned. "I learned from the best." A farewell to Elm Street. Years later, on the 20th anniversary of the Elm Street incident, Malik and David returned to the mural that had become a symbol of their journey. Time had transformed both of them. Malik was now a man in his 30s, and David had retired, though he still volunteered at the foundation. The mural had been lovingly maintained by the community, with flowers and messages of gratitude placed at its base. A small plaque had been added, reading, "In honor of Malik Carter, whose courage and resilience sparked a movement for justice. May his story remind us that one voice can change the world." As they stood before the mural, a group of children approached, their laughter filling the air. One of them recognized Malik and excitedly asked for a picture. He obliged, crouching to their level and laughing along with them. After the children ran off, David turned to his son. "You've come a long way, Malik. I'm so proud of you." Malik smiled, his voice steady and full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." They stood together in silence, the weight of their journey settling into a peaceful conclusion. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the mural. It felt symbolic, a new chapter beginning as the world continued to evolve. A lasting impact. Malik's story didn't end there, but the foundation of his legacy was firmly established. The changes he and David had fought for continued to inspire new waves of activism and reform. Communities across the globe embraced the values of empathy, accountability, and justice that the Carters had championed. As Malik looked to the future, he felt a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just the boy in the wheelchair anymore. He was a force for change, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that even in the face of adversity, courage could prevail. And for David, the greatest gift was watching his son thrive, knowing they had turned a moment of pain into a lifetime of progress. Together, they had proven that justice wasn't just a dream. It was a legacy, one that would endure for generations to come.